The old man at the corner counter reached for the salt shaker, and his flannel sleeve slid back 3 inches, and 41 years of silence ended in less than a heartbeat. A young soldier 2 stools down, 26 in pressed Class Bs, halfway through a stack of pancakes, set his coffee cup down so hard the saucer cracked. He did not breathe. He stood straight up, squared his shoulders, and rendered a salute so slow and so deliberate that every fork in that diner stopped moving. "Son, what the hell are you doing?" the manager snapped from behind the register. The soldier did not lower his hand. "Sir, you don't know who that is. If you believe some men carry honour, the world will never see. Type respect in the comments below and stay with me. What happens next will leave you speechless." The old man's name was Harlan Gray. He was 78 years old, and for the last 19 years he had eaten breakfast at the same counter at Maple Street Diner, every Tuesday and every Friday morning at 6:14 on the dot. He always took the 3rd stool from the wall, never the 1st, never the 2nd, because that one let him keep his back close to the corner and his eyes on the door without being obvious about it. He drove a 1994 Ford Ranger with a cracked tail light he had been meaning to fix for 5 years. He wore the same blue flannel over a plain white t-shirt almost every day in the colder months, and a brown jacket so worn at the elbows that the lining showed through in 2 places. His hands were the size of dinner plates and crisscrossed with thin white scars he never explained. When he poured his own coffee, his right hand shook just a little. Not enough that anyone noticed, but enough that he held the cup with both hands when he drank. He lived alone in a single-story house on the east side of town, the same house his late wife Eleanor had picked out in 1973. He had no children. He had a small back garden where he grew tomatoes and peppers, and an old golden retriever named Bishop who slept on a pillow beside his recliner. People in town knew his name because he had lived there forever, but almost no one knew anything else about him. He did not talk about himself. He did not talk much at all. When asked what he had done for a living, he would say the word army, and then change the subject so smoothly that people forgot they had asked. But every Tuesday morning, when he sat down at that 3rd stool and reached for the menu he had memorized 2 decades ago, his right sleeve would always sit too tight against his wrist, and the dark edge of something that looked like the tail of a black bird, would peek out from the cuff. Most people thought it was a smudge of grease. A few thought it was an old scar. None of them ever asked, and not a single one of them, in 19 years of seeing him 3 times a week, had ever once leaned close enough to see what the rest of that mark actually was. But this Tuesday, the 3rd Tuesday in October, with a cold rain coming down outside and the smell of bacon grease thick in the air, Harlan Gray would push his sleeve up 2 inches farther than usual, and a stranger sitting 6 feet away would see what 19 years of regulars had missed, and nothing in that diner or in his quiet life would ever look the same again. Maple Street Diner had been on the corner of Maple and 6th since 1962. It still had the original red vinyl stools and the original chrome trim along the counter, and the same hand-lettered sign in the front window that read, "Breakfast all day." The floor was checkered black and white linoleum, scuffed down to grey in 2 long strips where 40 years of waitresses had walked between the booths and the kitchen pass. The fluorescent light over the cash register had been buzzing for 6 months and nobody had bothered to fix it. Marlene Coffey had worked there for 31 years. She was 62, stood 5'3", and could carry 4 plates up one arm without spilling a drop of syrup. She knew Harlan's order before he sat down: 2 eggs over medium, dry wheat toast, side of bacon, black coffee. And she always set the cup down in front of him before he looked up. She called him sweetheart because that was what she called everyone, but the way she said it to Harlan had something quieter in it than the way she said it to the truckers. The rain was steady that morning. The bell over the door rang every few minutes. Construction guys in their high-vis vests, 2 nurses coming off the night shift at the county hospital, a man in a suit who always took the booth by the window and never said a word to anyone. The diner smelled like coffee and grilled onions and the slightly sweet scorch of something that had been on the griddle a beat too long. Then there was the new manager. His name was Brent. He was 31 years old, 2 months into the job, and he walked through that diner like he owned the floor he was standing on. He had bought the place from old Earl Coffey, Marlene's brother, when Earl's heart finally gave out in August. Brent had ideas. He talked a lot about operational efficiency and table turnover and modernising the customer base. He had already put up a small printed sign by the register that read, "No loitering," 45-minute limit. Marlene had seen that sign go up and said nothing. She had also seen Brent's eyes track Harlan Gray on the last 2 Tuesdays, watching the old man eat slowly, drink 3 refills of coffee, sit there reading a folded newspaper for almost an hour and a half. She had seen the calculation in Brent's face, and she had a very bad feeling about what was coming. What she didn't know, what nobody in that diner knew, was that the young soldier who would walk through the door at exactly 6:38 that morning had spent the last 4 years studying the kind of crests that show up on the inside of an old man's wrist, and was about to recognize one that the United States government still did not want anyone to see. The bell above the door rang at 6:38, and Sergeant Daniel Rios stepped inside out of the rain, shook the water from the brim of his cap, and folded it under his arm. He was 26 years old, 6'1", with the kind of build that comes from carrying a 40-pound ruck up hills for a living. His Class B uniform was crisp. The single rocker and 3 stripes on his sleeve were sharp. He scanned the room out of habit before he even looked at the menu. Corners first, exits second, faces third. Then he walked to the counter and took the stool 2 down from Harlan Gray, with 1 empty seat between them. He did not look at Harlan. Not at first. He just nodded at Marlene, ordered pancakes and bacon and black coffee, and pulled out his phone to scroll through something while he waited. Harlan was halfway through his eggs. Brent came out of the kitchen at 6:41, drying his hands on a towel, and his eyes went straight to Harlan's plate. Empty coffee cup, folded newspaper. The man had been there since 6:14. Brent walked behind the counter and stopped in front of Harlan, leaned his palms on the chrome edge, and put on the smile he used when he wanted something to sound friendly that wasn't. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to need you to wrap things up here pretty soon. We've got a lot of folks coming in for the breakfast rush and we need the seat." Harlan looked up slowly. He had pale grey eyes, set deep, and they did not blink when they landed on Brent's face. He looked at the man for a long second. Then he looked down the length of the counter, where there were 4 empty stools to Brent's left and 2 more past Sergeant Rios on the right. He said very quietly, "I'll be done in a few minutes." He went back to his eggs. Brent's smile tightened. "Sir, I don't think you understand. There's a 45-minute limit on the seats during peak hours. It's posted right by the register. You've been here since 6:15, so when I say I need the seat, I'm not really asking." Harlan set his fork down. He folded his napkin in half, then in half again, and placed it beside his plate. He did not look up. He did not raise his voice. He just said, "I'll finish my coffee and I'll go." Down the counter, Sergeant Rios's eyes moved off his phone for the first time since he had sat down. Marlene, refilling a cup 3 booths over, went very still. She had known Harlan Gray for almost 20 years. She had never once heard him say anything sharp to anyone, but she had also never seen him fold a napkin like that, slow and deliberate and exactly square, and something in the back of her chest tightened at the sight of it. She had seen her father do that exact same thing, once, the year before he died. He had been a Marine in Korea. He had folded his napkin like that the night a man at a wedding had made a joke about Chosin Reservoir, and her father had stood up from that table and walked out of the reception without saying another word. Brent did not move. He stood there with his hands still flat on the counter and his weight tipped forward, the way a man stands when he wants the person across from him to feel small. A few heads in the diner had turned now. The 2 nurses at the booth by the window were watching over the rims of their cups. The man in the suit had folded his newspaper. Even the cook, a heavy-set man named Roy with a tattoo of an eagle on his forearm, had stopped scraping the grill. "Look," Brent said, and his voice climbed half a notch louder than it needed to be. "I get it. You like coming in here. That's fine. But this isn't a community centre, sir. We're running a business. And honestly, with all due respect, I've been watching you the last few weeks. You order the cheapest thing on the menu. You sit here for 90 minutes. You drink 3 coffees on a $2.50 check. The math doesn't work for me." The diner had gone quiet enough now that the buzzing fluorescent over the register sounded loud. A man in a contractor's vest at the end of the counter snickered into his cup. Another guy at a booth, mid-40s with a thick gold watch and a thicker neck, leaned out and said, half to himself but loud enough to carry, "Cheap old-timers, man. Every single diner has one. Sit there all morning like the place owes them something." Brent gave a short, dry laugh at that. Not loud, but just loud enough to land. Harlan did not look at the man in the booth. He did not look at Brent. He picked up his coffee cup with both hands and took a slow sip, set it down carefully on the saucer, and stared straight ahead at the silver napkin dispenser in front of him. His right hand, when he set the cup down, was shaking a little more than it had been a minute earlier. Marlene, behind the counter now, opened her mouth to say something. She'd worked at this diner for 31 years. Her brother had owned it. She had never spoken back to a manager in her life, but she opened her mouth and what came out was a quiet, "Brent, sweetheart, just leave him be." Brent turned his head slowly toward her, and his smile flattened into something else. "Marlene," he said, "I appreciate you, I do. But I'm running this place now. So why don't you let me handle the customers and you handle the coffee?" Marlene's face went a shade paler. She did not speak again. 2 stools down, Sergeant Daniel Rios set his phone face down on the counter. He did not stand up yet. He did not say anything. But his right hand had moved off his coffee cup, and it was now resting flat on the countertop, very still, the way a man's hand goes still right before he decides to do something he cannot undo. And Harlan Gray, sitting 1 seat away with his sleeve still pulled down over his wrist, had no idea, none, that in the next 4 minutes he was going to reach across the counter for a glass salt shaker. His right cuff was going to ride up exactly 2¼ inches, and the man in the booth with the gold watch was going to spend the rest of his life replaying what he was about to say next, and what it cost him in front of a room of strangers. Harlan Gray had not always been a quiet man. There had been a time, 50-some years ago, when he had been the kind of man who laughed loud at bad jokes and sang along to country songs in the cab of a borrowed pickup truck. There had been a time when he could tell a story so well that grown men leaned in, elbows on a bar, and forgot about their drinks. He had been 21. He had been engaged to a girl named Eleanor with red hair and a dimple in her left cheek. He had a job lined up at his uncle's machine shop in Wheeling, West Virginia. He had a future that fit on a postcard. And then he had volunteered, and then he had been pulled, on the strength of a single physical and a single interview with a quiet man in an unmarked office, into a unit that did not officially exist. He did not think about it most days. He had spent the better part of a half-century not thinking about it. He had built a life on the work of not thinking about it. The garden, the dog, the same diner 3 days a week, the same drive home, the same recliner, the same news at 6. He had taught himself, slowly and with great effort, how to be a man whose hands did not need to do what they had been trained to do. But this morning, with Brent's voice still hanging in the air, and the contractor still snickering at the end of the counter, Harlan was thinking about it. He was thinking about a riverbank in a country he was not supposed to have been in, and a kid named Tomlinson from Tulsa, who had been 19 years old and had bled out in his arms in 7 minutes. He was thinking about the last thing Tomlinson had said, which had been the name of his mother and then a question about whether the mail would still come. He was thinking about the weight of a man's body when the breath finally goes out of it, and how that weight is somehow heavier than it was a second before. He took another sip of his coffee. His hand was shaking a little more. The salt shaker on the counter in front of him was empty. Marlene, on her way past, had not had a chance to refill it. There was a full one down the counter sitting just past the napkin holder, about an arm's reach away. Harlan reached for it. He had to lean. He had to extend his arm fully across the chrome. The cuff of his blue flannel, which had been buttoned at the wrist that morning but had loosened over the course of breakfast, slid back along his forearm. It rode up past the heel of his hand. It rode up past the bone of his wrist. It rode up 2¼ inches above where it had been a moment before. And on the inside of his right forearm, dark and faded but still unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen its like, was the tattoo. It was not a large mark. It sat on the soft inside of his forearm 3 inches below the wrist, and at a glance it looked like nothing more than an old smudge, the kind of vague dark shape that aging skin makes of any ink that has been there for 50 years. But the shape was not vague to the right set of eyes. It was a black bird in mid-dive, wings folded back, talons forward. Behind the bird, a small rectangle that was not quite a flag. Below it, 3 numerals and a single letter, so faded now that they were almost the colour of the skin itself. Sergeant Daniel Rios had grown up the son of a Special Forces Master Sergeant who had died in a non-combat helicopter accident in 2009. Rios had spent his whole life in and around men who did not say what they did for a living. He had been to 2 unit reunions where his father's old friends, grey men, soft-spoken men, men who hugged him and called him kid, and who did not exchange last names with each other, had drunk beer in a backyard in North Carolina and told stories that had no place names in them. He had spent 4 years in the army himself, the last 2 of those 4 attached to a battalion staff that handled mission histories. He was not supposed to read, but had read anyway. He knew that crest. He had seen it exactly twice in his life, once on a yellowed photograph in a binder marked classified in red across the top corner, and once on the inside cover of a book his father had kept on a high shelf in the garage. The book had no title on the spine. His father had once caught him looking at it and had taken it gently out of his hands and put it back on the shelf and said, "When you're older, son, and maybe not even then." The mark on the inside of Harlan Gray's forearm was the insignia of a long-range reconnaissance detachment that had operated off the books across 3 borders that the United States government had publicly insisted it had never crossed. The unit had existed for 4 years. It had been formally decommissioned in 1972, and its record sealed for 50 years. Of the original 62 operators selected and trained, 51 had been killed in action. 2 had died in captivity. 3 had simply never come back from the field, and their names had been quietly removed from the active roster and never spoken again. That left 6 men. 6. Sergeant Daniel Rios was looking at one of them, eating eggs at a diner counter in a small town in eastern Ohio, on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, while a 31-year-old manager who had never served a day in anything called him cheap. Rios stood up. He did not say a word. He did not look at Brent. He did not look at the man in the booth with the gold watch. He stepped back from his stool, came to attention with a snap of his heels that rang against the linoleum, squared his shoulders, raised his right hand to the brim of his cap, and held the salute. And every single person in that diner, every fork, every cup, every breath, stopped. What none of them knew, not Brent, not Marlene, not the man in the suit, not the contractor at the end of the counter, was that Sergeant Daniel Rios was about to say a single name out loud, a name that had been classified for half a century, and the saying of that name was going to do something to the air in that room that none of them had ever felt before. The salute held. Brent stared at Sergeant Rios. He blinked twice. Then a small, uncertain laugh broke out of him. The kind of laugh that comes when a man does not understand what he is looking at and is trying to make it small enough to fit inside something he does. "Hey, buddy," he said, and the word buddy came out wrong. What is this? Sit down, man. Eat your pancakes." Rios did not move. He held the salute. His eyes were on Harlan Gray. Harlan, for his part, had frozen with the salt shaker still in his hand. He had not yet pulled his arm back. He was looking at Rios with an expression that was not surprise exactly and not fear, but something in between, the look of a man who has spent 50 years knowing this moment might come, and has spent every one of those years hoping it would not. Slowly, very slowly, he set the salt shaker down. He pulled his arm back across the counter. He tugged his cuff back down over his wrist as if hiding the tattoo now could somehow take back the last 30 seconds. It could not. Rios held the salute for a count of 7. Then he lowered his hand, came down out of attention, and turned his head toward Brent. His voice, when he spoke, was very even and very quiet, and it carried to every corner of the diner. "Sir," he said to Brent, "I would like you to step away from this man." Brent's jaw worked. "Excuse me?" "I would like you," Rios said again, and this time there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Not anger, not yet, but the hard, flat edge that comes into a soldier's voice when he's making a decision about what he will and will not allow to happen in front of him, to step away from this man, and to apologize to him, and to bring him a fresh cup of coffee, on the house. A short laugh broke out from the booth with the gold watch. "Oh, come on. Are you serious right now?" Rios did not look at the booth. His eyes stayed on Brent. Brent's face had gone red in 2 patches high on his cheeks. He was a young man, and he had been embarrassed in front of his own diner, and now an active duty soldier was telling him what to do in front of his customers. Whatever good sense he might have had in another moment, whatever instinct might have told him to back up and ask a question instead of doubling down, got drowned by the heat in his face. "Look," Brent said, and his voice was loud now, too loud. "I don't know what your deal is, soldier, but I'm not going to be told how to run my business by some kid who walked in off the street 10 minutes ago. This man," he jabbed a finger toward Harlan without looking at him, "has been freeloading in here for years. He sits, he stares, he takes up a stool. I don't care if he was in the military. Half the country was in the military. That doesn't entitle him to a stool for 90 minutes on a $2 check." Marlene made a small sound. It was not quite a word. It was the sound a person makes when they watch someone else step off a cliff they cannot see. Rios took one slow breath. Then he turned his whole body toward Brent, and his next sentence was the one that broke the diner open. "Sir," Sergeant Rios said. "You don't know what you're looking at." Brent threw his hands up. "Oh, here we go. Okay, soldier. Enlighten me. What am I looking at? Some old guy in a flannel shirt sitting on my counter drinking my coffee for free. Educate me." Rios did not answer right away. He looked at Harlan. He looked at the cuff of Harlan's flannel, pulled back down now, hiding what he had seen. He looked at Harlan's pale grey eyes, which were fixed on the napkin dispenser and would not lift. He looked at Harlan, and he asked one quiet question, in a voice so respectful it made the back of Marlene's neck go cold. "Sir," he said, "do I have your permission?" Harlan did not look up. He didn't move. For a long second, Rios thought the answer was going to be no, that the old man was going to ask him to stand down, and that the moment was going to dissolve, and Harlan was going to pay his check and walk out into the rain and never come back. Then, very slowly, Harlan Gray nodded once. He did not speak. He did not look up. He just gave the smallest, slowest nod. That was all Sergeant Rios needed. He turned back to Brent. He took 2 steps closer to the counter, until he was standing exactly between Brent and Harlan, his shoulders square to the manager. He pulled a small leather folder out of his uniform pocket, his military ID and a separate card that Brent could not see, and set it gently on the chrome counter. "My name is Sergeant Daniel Rios," he said, "United States Army, 82nd Airborne, Bravo Company. I've been in uniform for 4 years. My father was in uniform for 26. I have stood at attention at the funerals of 9 men, including my father. I have a working knowledge of every long tab, every patch, every crest, and every classified unit insignia issued in the United States military between 1965 and the present day." Brent opened his mouth. Rios did not let him in. "What I just saw on this man's forearm," Rios said, and now his voice rose just enough to fill the diner without becoming a shout, "is a unit crest that has been seen by fewer than 300 living human beings on this planet. It belongs to a detachment that was formally decommissioned in 1972, whose records remained classified until 3 years ago, and whose original roster contained 62 names. 51 of those names are on a wall in Arlington. 5 more are on no wall at all because their families were never told where they died. That leaves 6. 6 men, sir. 6. The diner had gone so quiet that the rain on the front window sounded like a drum. Brent's mouth was still open. He had not closed it. The man at the booth with the gold watch had set his fork down. The contractor at the end of the counter was no longer smiling. The 2 nurses had not blinked. Marlene had both her hands flat on the counter, as if she needed to hold the diner down to keep it from floating away. Rios looked at Brent. "You just told one of those 6 men that the math didn't work for you." He let that sit. "Sir," he said, very quietly now, "I think the math is going to start working a little differently in about 4 minutes, because the man whose name is on the back of that classified roster is sitting right here. And what he did, in the 4 years he served, is the reason a lot of other people you've never heard of got to come home and run diners and open small businesses and tell strangers that the math didn't work for them. So if you would like to keep speaking, sir, I would invite you to keep speaking. But I would also invite you to consider that there is going to be a video of this conversation on the internet by lunchtime, and there is going to be a phone call to a certain office in Virginia by 3 o'clock this afternoon, and your 45-minute table limit is going to become the smallest problem in your life." Brent's face had gone the colour of unbaked dough. He had not said a word in the last 40 seconds. His right hand, which had been resting on the counter, had pulled back to his side. He was looking at Sergeant Rios, and then at Harlan, and then back at Rios, and his eyes had the unfocused quality of a man trying to do a math problem in a language he doesn't speak. The man in the booth with the gold watch had picked his fork back up and then set it down again, as if he wasn't sure what to do with his hands. The contractor at the end of the counter had quietly turned his stool to face away from the conversation. Sergeant Rios did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mr. Gray," he said, turning slightly toward Harlan, "I am not going to say your unit designation out loud in this room. That is your call to make, sir, and I will follow your lead, but with your permission, I would like to say enough that this gentleman," he tilted his head just barely toward Brent, "understands what he's standing in front of." Harlan's hands were folded in his lap now. He had not lifted his eyes from the napkin dispenser. For a long moment he did not respond. Then he gave that same small, slow nod. Rios turned back to face the diner. Not just Brent, but the whole room. He did not perform. He did not raise his arms. He simply spoke, the way a man speaks at a graveside. In the late 1960s, he said, the United States ran a small number of long-range reconnaissance programs that operated outside of the formal chain of command. The units that ran those programs were drawn from Special Forces, from Marine Recon, and from a handful of other places. They were not on any organizational chart. Their members were not eligible for the medals they earned. Their families were told they were stationed elsewhere. Their letters home, when they wrote them, were postmarked from locations they had never been to. He paused. He looked at Harlan, just for a second, and then back at the room. One of those units lost more than 90% of its operational personnel in less than 4 years. The men who survived were debriefed in a building with no windows. They were told, in writing, that they could not speak about their service to their wives, to their parents, to their children, to their priests, or to each other. They were told that if they spoke, they would lose their pensions, they would lose their VA benefits, and they would, in some cases, be looking at federal time. Most of them obeyed. Most of them came home and went to work in machine shops and on farms and in factories, and never once told the people who loved them what they had done. He let his eyes settle on Brent. The man you just called a freeloader, he said, is one of the men who came home. He did not get a parade. He did not get a medal he could wear. He got a sealed file in a vault in Northern Virginia, and a tattoo on his forearm that he was told to keep covered for the rest of his natural life. He has kept it covered for 51 years. The only reason you and I are looking at it right now is that he reached for a salt shaker your manager refused to refill. The contractor at the end of the counter had taken his cap off. He was holding it against his chest. He had not made a conscious decision to do so. Marlene was crying. She had not made a sound, but the tears were running down her face in 2 clean lines, and she was not bothering to wipe them away. Sergeant Rios took 1 step closer to the counter. He looked down at Harlan Gray, who still had not lifted his head, and his voice gentled. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to tell them one thing, just one. Will you allow me that?" Harlan was quiet for a long count. Then, very slowly, he lifted his head. He looked at Rios for the first time that morning. His pale grey eyes were not wet. They were calm. They were the eyes of a man who had been ready for this conversation for half a century and had finally arrived inside of it. He said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Tell them about the river." Rios's throat worked. He nodded once. He turned back to the room. In April of 1970, he said, in a country the United States was not officially conducting operations in, an 8-man recon team was inserted by helicopter at last light to confirm the location of a supply route. The team was compromised within 6 hours of insertion. 6 of the 8 men were killed in the first contact. 2 survived. They were separated. One of them, the team leader, made the call to break contact and head for the extract point alone. The other man, wounded in the leg, out of radio contact with no rations and a sidearm with 11 rounds left in it, chose instead to go back. He paused. He went back to the contact site, Rios said. He went back under fire. He recovered the bodies of his 6 men, one at a time, over the course of 3 nights, and he carried them, one by one, on his back, through terrain that the United States military still uses as a training reference for impossible movement, to a riverbank 12 kilometers south of the original insertion point. He did this so that those 6 men would not be left in a country we were not officially in. He did this so that their families would have a body to bury. He did this with a bullet in his thigh and a fractured collarbone and no food, and 3 hours of sleep across 9 days. When he reached the riverbank with the last man on his back, a Marine helicopter pilot, who had violated 3 direct orders to be in that airspace, pulled him out, along with all 6 bodies, in a single extraction under enemy fire. Rios's voice cracked just barely on the next word. "All 6 of those men," he said, "are buried under their own names in their own hometowns today because of him." Nobody in the diner moved. Nobody breathed. "The man who went back," Rios said, "received an award that has never been publicly acknowledged. The pilot who violated his orders to extract him received a private letter of commendation from a president who is no longer alive and was honorably discharged a year later. The team leader who made the call to break contact alone and survived to make the call to extract was the man who, 51 years later, was just told that the math didn't work on his cup of coffee. He turned very slowly and faced Brent. "That man," Sergeant Rios said, "is sitting on the third stool from the wall. And I don't know what kind of morning you thought you were going to have, sir, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that you're about to have a very different one. Because the man at the end of this counter has just pulled out his phone, and he's been recording for the last 6 minutes. And by tonight, every veteran in this country is going to know your name. And by Friday, sir, so will the rest of us." The man at the end of the counter did, in fact, have his phone out. He was the contractor, the one with the high-vis vest, and his phone had been propped against his coffee cup since the moment Rios had stood up. He had not said a word the entire time. His face was wet. Brent looked at him. He looked at the phone. He looked at the small red recording dot. The colour drained out of his face the way water drains out of a sink. Slow at first, and then all at once. Brent started. He stopped. He started again. "I didn't—" He could not find the next word. He turned his head toward Harlan, and his mouth opened and closed twice without sound. Harlan looked at him. For the first time in the entire encounter, Harlan Grey looked at Brent directly. His pale grey eyes were not angry. They were not satisfied. They were not vindicated. They were instead very tired and very kind, in the way that the eyes of a man who's buried 6 friends in a riverbank can sometimes be tired and kind at the same time. "Son," he said. Just that. One word. Brent swallowed. The patches of red on his cheeks had spread now, down his neck and into the collar of his shirt. His eyes had gone wet at the corners. He was, by anyone's measure, a different man than the one who had walked behind the counter 4 minutes earlier. "Sir," Brent said. His voice was small. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Harlan said. "That was the point." Brent's face crumpled. He put one hand flat on the counter to steady himself. He looked at Marlene, and then at Sergeant Rios, and then at the floor. "I'm sorry," he said. "Mr. Grey, I am so sorry." The man in the booth with the gold watch, the one who had snickered about cheap old-timers, stood up out of his booth. He walked across the diner slowly with his hat in his hand. He stopped a respectful distance from Harlan's stool. He did not try to shake the old man's hand. He just stood there with his head lowered and said, "Sir, I owe you an apology too. I said something I shouldn't have said. I'm sorry." Harlan looked at him. He nodded once. The contractor at the end of the counter put his phone down. He stood up. He walked the length of the counter, around past Brent and stopped behind Sergeant Rios. He took off his work cap. He held it against his chest. "I served, Mr. Grey," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Marines, 96 to 04, 2 tours, nothing like what you did. But I served. And I want you to know that I have never in my whole life been in a room with one of you. I didn't know there were any of you left." Harlan's mouth twitched just barely at the corner. It was almost a smile. "There aren't many of us," he said. Marlene pushed away from the counter, walked around the end of it, and stopped in front of Harlan. Her face was streaked. She did not say anything. She just opened her arms, and after a second Harlan stood up off his stool, slowly with both hands braced on the chrome, and let her hug him. The diner watched in silence. Sergeant Rios, still standing at parade rest beside Harlan's stool, lowered his head. The hug lasted longer than a hug between 2 old friends usually lasts, and shorter than the moment deserved. When Marlene finally stepped back, she kept one hand on Harlan's shoulder, as if she was afraid he might dissolve if she let go. Brent had not moved from behind the counter. His hands hung at his sides. His eyes were on the floor. After a long moment, he took a slow breath, walked around the end of the counter, and came to a stop a respectful distance from Harlan. He did not try to take the man's hand. He had the sense, finally, to know better. "Mr. Grey," he said, and his voice cracked on the name. "I was wrong. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about a lot of things, and I don't know how to make it right, but I want to. I want to try." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. "You can start," he said quietly, "by taking that sign down off your register." Brent's eyes welled. He nodded. He turned, walked back behind the counter, lifted the small printed sign off the wall by the cash register, "No loitering, 45-minute limit," and crumpled it slowly in his fist. He looked at Marlene. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said earlier, about the coffee, about how you should. I'm sorry." Marlene wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She nodded. She did not say it was all right because she was not going to lie to him, and she was not going to lie to herself, but she nodded, and that was enough for now. Sergeant Rios stepped back from the counter. He came to attention one more time. He looked at Harlan and saluted, and Harlan, slowly, painfully, with the stiff motion of a man whose right shoulder had been holding a 40-year-old fracture together, returned it. Then he sat back down on his stool. He picked up his coffee cup with both hands. It was empty. Marlene refilled it without being asked, and her hand shook so much she spilled a little onto the saucer, and she laughed at herself once, a wet, broken little laugh, and refilled it again. Harlan took a slow sip. He set the cup down. He looked at Sergeant Rios, who had sat back down on his own stool now, 2 seats away. "Son," he said, "where'd your dad serve?" Rios's throat worked. "He was Special Forces, sir, Master Sergeant. He passed in '09. Helicopter accident, training exercise out of Bragg." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, "What was his name?" "Miguel Rios, sir. They called him Mike." Harlan closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a long count. When he opened them again, he was looking at Sergeant Daniel Rios with an expression no one in that diner could have read, except maybe the contractor at the end of the counter, who had served and lost people and knew what the look was. "I knew your father," Harlan said. The contractor made a small sound in the back of his throat. Sergeant Rios did not move. He did not breathe. He stared at Harlan Gray across one empty stool for a long suspended moment, and the rain on the front window kept tapping its quiet small rhythm against the glass. And somewhere in the back of the kitchen, a timer went off, and Roy did not move to silence it. What none of them, not Brent, not Marlene, not the contractor, not the man with the gold watch, and not even Sergeant Daniel Rios himself, could have known yet was that the next sentence Harlan Gray was about to say would close a 15-year-old loop in a way that would take Daniel Rios to his knees on the linoleum floor of that diner before the morning was over. "Your dad," Harlan said, "came up through a different program than mine. Different generation. Different war. But the community is small. We knew each other. Not well, but enough." He took another sip of his coffee. His hand had stopped shaking. "In '08, he said, "I got a call from a man we both knew. Your father had a son who was about to enlist. He wasn't sure he wanted you to. He wasn't sure he wanted you near any of it. He asked me, because I was retired, and because I had been out a long time, and because he trusted me to give him the answer that wasn't the company line. He asked me whether the life was still worth it. Whether it would still be worth it for his son, in the kind of war you were going to walk into." He looked at Daniel Rios. "I told him yes," Harlan said. "I told him that the life is hard, and that it will take from you in ways you can't predict, and that there are nights you will wish you had picked something else. But I told him that the men you serve with will be the best men you will ever know, and that the work matters even when the world will not let you say what the work was. I told him that if his son had it in him, he should go." Sergeant Rios's eyes had filled. He was not blinking because he knew that if he blinked the tears would fall, and he was not yet ready to let them fall in front of strangers. "6 months later," Harlan said, "your dad sent me a letter. He told me you had signed your papers. He thanked me. He said he hoped he would see me at a reunion someday and shake my hand." He was quiet for a long count. "I never got to shake his hand, son," Harlan said, "and I have carried that for 15 years. Sergeant Daniel Rios got down off his stool. He took 2 steps toward Harlan Gray. He went down on one knee on the black and white checkered linoleum, and he took the old man's left hand in both of his own, and he pressed his forehead against the back of Harlan's hand, and his shoulders shook once, hard, and then he did not move at all for a long time. Harlan rested his right hand very gently on the back of Daniel's head. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The diner stood still around them. After a long while, Daniel stood up. He wiped his face openly with both palms. He did not apologize for it. He held his hand out to Harlan, and Harlan took it. And they shook the way men shake when they are agreeing to something neither of them has said out loud. The story, after that, did not stay in that diner. The contractor's video, 6 minutes long, shaky with the sound of the rain in the background, was online by 10 that morning. By noon, it had been shared 60,000 times. By the next morning, it had been shared 2 million. The phone calls to Maple Street Diner started before lunch. By Wednesday afternoon, there was a line out the door of veterans who had driven in from 3 states to sit, just for a minute, on the stool next to the third stool from the wall. Brent did not charge any of them. He had taken his sign down off the register and put a different one in its place, handwritten in his own hand, that read simply, "Veterans eat free. All day. Every day. No questions." Brent kept that sign up. He kept it up the next week, and the next month, and a year later it was still there, taped to the wall above the register where the old no loitering sign used to be. He had also very quietly hired Marlene as the diner's general manager and given her a raise and the keys to the back door, and he had taken a smaller office in the back and started learning, for the first time in his life, how to listen before he spoke. Sergeant Daniel Rios drove 3 hours from Fort Bragg to Maple Street Diner once a month for the rest of Harlan Gray's life. He always took the stool next to the third stool from the wall. He always ordered pancakes and bacon and black coffee. Harlan always ordered 2 eggs over medium and dry wheat toast. They did not talk much most mornings. They did not need to. They were, in a way that no one else in that diner could have understood, the last living members of 2 families that did not officially exist. Harlan Gray passed away on a Tuesday morning in the spring of his 83rd year, in his own bed, with his golden retriever Bishop curled at his feet and a folded American flag on the nightstand that had been delivered to him by Sergeant Daniel Rios, in person, 3 months earlier. The flag had no card with it. It had not needed one. His funeral was attended by 471 people. 5 of them were the other surviving members of his unit. 5 grey, soft-spoken men who flew in from 5 different states and who hugged Daniel Rios in the parking lot of the funeral home as if he were one of their own, because in a way that mattered, he was. They stood in a line at the gravesite and they saluted as the bugler played, and not one of them spoke a word. The third stool from the wall at Maple Street Diner sits empty most mornings now. Marlene polishes it every Tuesday and every Friday at 6:14, the way she has every Tuesday and every Friday since the morning a young soldier stood up and saluted an old man in a blue flannel shirt. Above the stool, on a small brass plate she had made herself, 3 words are engraved in plain capital letters: "He came back." So if you have ever passed an old man at a diner counter and seen nothing more than a worn coat and a slow cup of coffee, remember this: you do not know what is under his sleeve. You do not know whose body he carried, or whose name he buried, or whose life he saved with a phone call you will never hear about. You do not know what he is not allowed to tell you. You only know what he lets you see. Honor the ones you cannot recognize. They are out there. They are eating eggs at the third stool from the wall. If this story moved you, if you believe these men and women deserve to be seen, subscribe to this channel and stay with us. There are more of them out there, and we are going to find every single one.